Okay, well, first of all, good morning, and thanks to Jacob for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I didn't get to work with Sam, but I did get to meet him many times in different conferences, and there was always something about him that struck me, and is that he was always willing to talk to you without even knowing you, and he was extremely nice. So it's very sad that he's no longer with us. I am also very happy to be here because I get to see Fred again. He's guilty for many of the things that I'm going to talk about. So if you don't like my talk, it's Fred's fault. I have many things to say about Fred, and one of the main points is that he's in the sense that I was describing before. Fred behaved in my first interactions with him in the same way as Sam did. He didn't know me, but he was extremely nice. In fact, the first times that I talked to him was through email, so we were talking about math through email, and he invited me to go to his house without knowing me, and so this is how I started collaborating with him, so I had to thank him quite a bit. So some of the ideas of the work that I'm going to talk about actually were developed back in the day when I was doing some work with Fred. So in any case, I'm also very glad that I'm talking after Omar, because my talk is quite related to what he was talking about. And the goal of the last part of my talk is try to connect the two topics. Okay, so the title of my talk is on the second homotopy group of the space of commuting n tuples in Lie groups. So the title actually describes what I'm going to talk about, is the computation of that second homotopy group. And this is a joint work with Alejandro Alem and Sam Gitler, and Simon Grishafer. Okay, so the basic setup is the same as in Omar's talk. So throughout this talk, G is going to be a compact Lie group, and in fact, I'm going to be thinking about the case where G is compact and connected. Okay. For every n, we can consider the set of commuting n tuples in G, which as in Omar's talk, I'm going to denote as hom from set to the n to G. And we're going to look at the n tuples that satisfy the conditions that they commute pairwise. Okay? Now, this set, the way I'm describing it is naturally inside is a subset of G to the n, and G is a Lie group, so it has a structure of a manifold. So in particular, I can give this set the subspace topology as a subspace of G to the n. So it's a subspace of a manifold. So from now on, I'm just going to refer to this set as the space of commuting n tuples in G. Okay. There is a first feature that one needs to keep in mind, and is the fact that whenever G is compact, then the space of commuting n tuples has the structure of a real variety, an algebraic variety, but in the general case, unless G is abelian, is going to have very complicated singularities. And that makes it quite tricky to understand. Okay? Now, there is another space that's going to play a key role in this talk, and which is the space of representations. So a first observation is that the group G acts on the space of commuting n tuples by conjugation. Namely, if I conjugate an n tuple by the same element, that tuple is also commutative. So we have a conjugation action, and the quotient space is denoted by rep, and it's called the space of representations. Okay. Now, geometrically, this guy appears in many settings, in geometry and physics, especially in quantum field, in Yang-Mills theories, And it's due to the fact that geometrically you have a representation. So this guy is actually representing something geometrically, which is the modular space of flat connections on principal G bundles over the N torus. This modular space actually already appeared in some of the previous talks. So there are two spaces that I'm going to be interested in, is the space of commuting tuples and the quotient space by the conjugation action, which is the space of representations. Okay? Now, so that you have an idea of the kinds of singularities that this guy has, I want to talk about a very simple example, which is my favorite example in this business, and is the example of SO3. Okay? So what is SO3? So SO3 is the 3 means 3 by 3 matrices with real coefficients. The O means that they are orthogonal, which means that the columns give you an orthonormal basis for R3, and the S means that they have determinant 1. So it's 3 by 3 orthogonal matrices that have determinant 1. Now, explained that way, that's kind of weird to think about geometrically. However, the elements in SO3 you can think about geometrically in a very simple way, and this is why this is my favorite example. You can think about a matrix as a rotation throughout a fixed axis in R3. So it's very simple. So what you have is you have a line, and if you want to multiply by this matrix a vector, what it's doing is rotating the vector throughout this axis. So it's very concrete. So it's rotation. Rotation in R3 through an axis. Okay? So what I want to try to understand is what happens when I take commuting pairs in SO3. Namely, let's try to understand what's happening when I take home C2 to SO3. So again, this means commuting matrices in SO3. So I only have 2 matrices in SO3, and I require that they commute. So something very simple. If we think about these matrices in this point of view, that we think about them as being rotations, well, then one can quickly realize that there are 2 possibilities for 2 matrices to commute with each other. Namely, one first possibility is that you have 2 matrices that correspond to rotations throughout the same axis. Because if you have 2 such matrices, when you do one matrix and then you do the other one, then the composite is rotation alpha plus beta, which is the same as rotating beta plus alpha. So that means if there are rotations throughout the same axis, then they commute by obvious reasons. Now, there is one thing that I want to say in this example, or in this case, and is the identity you can think about as being a rotation throughout any axis, an angle of 0 degrees. And that very simple fact is the one that's going to create singularities in this example. So the fact that the identity is rotational around any axis is the one that is creating the singularities. Now there is another case. 2 matrices can commute with each other if they represent rotations by 180 degrees. That is to say, they are involutions. That means that when I do it twice, you get the identity. But the angles of rotations have to be perpendicular to each other. Okay? So that's a very, very geometric description of what happens in the space of commuting pairs. So you have 2 cases. Or either you are rotating along the same axis, or you are rotating around perpendicular axis. Okay? Now, if you think about what this is saying in the space of commuting elements, there is a very simple but key observation here. If I take a path in this space, and I start with a pair of commuting elements of this kind, I cannot finish in the other kind. And vice versa. If I start with commuting pairs that are involutions with respect to perpendicular axis, when I move in the space of commuting pairs, the axis of rotations, they can change, but they have to remain perpendicular. So, and those are the only possibilities. So what that really is saying is that this space has two connected components, okay? Which is first key feature of the space of commuting n tuples. In general, it has many connected components, okay? The second feature is that those components can be can have singularities, and let me try to explain what you get in this case. So let's try to think about the space of all commuting n tuple or commuting pairs of the first kind. So to give you a pair of matrices that are rotations through the same axis, what do I have to tell you? I have to tell you the axis of rotation, and I have to give you two angles of rotation. Now, the axis of rotation I can specify by picking a point in the two sphere, except that there is a redundancy, which is if I pick a point and its antipodal point, they define the same line. So really, I should be thinking about RP2, but let me think about the two sphere. So let's just say that I pick a point in the sphere, so I pick, say, an orientation of the line, and I have to give you two angles of rotation. Now, now when I think about the other way around, now if I think about the line in the other way around, what is happening is that I'm seeing the same pair, but now rotating in a different way, namely that corresponds to what would be, if I think about the angle as an element in S1, I think when I look at it like this, I see the complex conjugate. So that explains roughly why this product space is appearing. So this tells me how to pick the line. This tells me the two angles of rotations, but I have to modify the action of set mod 2 to get rid of the ambiguity. Okay? So that's the geometric explanation of why this guy is appearing, but I haven't explained to you why this RP2 you have to modify. And the reason is that if you think about the identity, then the identity is the identity comma the identity. You can think about that same element as rotation around any axis. Okay, so if you pick any different axis and rotate 0 degrees for the two of them, you get the identity comma the identity, which is the same element. So in this space, that corresponds to a copy of RP2, so you actually have to modify that. So that's why you get, this is a smooth manifold actually of dimension 4 after you modify set mod 2, but then in that 4 manifold, you're taking a copy of RP2, you're collapsing it to a point. So that's no longer a manifold. Now, it's actually quite nice to think about the other component, and there is a quick observation, which is in the space of commuting pairs, these guys are unique up to conjugation. And with that observation, one can prove that the other connected component is the 3-sphere modified by the quaternion group. So this is my favorite example because you can say geometrically what's happening. You have two components, you can describe them. One is singular, the other is actually quite nice. Okay? Now, so throughout this talk, we're just going to be thinking about what is usually referred to as the generic component. Namely, I'm just going to be thinking about the connected component that contains the identity. Okay? So in the previous example, that corresponds to this component. Okay? And I'm just going to denote this guy, that connected component. I'm just going to put a 1 here to remember that that's the connected component of the commuting n tuple 1, 1, 1, 1. Okay? Now, there is a very nice characterization of this connected component, namely, a commuting n tuple belongs to it if and only if there is a maximal torus in G that contains all of them. Okay? Now, so this sort of explains these two cases. Now, rotations around the same axis actually belong to a maximal torus in SO3, but involutions with respect to perpendicular axes, they form an abelian group, an abelian subgroup that is maximal. So that cannot be put inside a maximal torus. Okay, so that explains why you have two components in this case. Okay. So this fact is going to play a key role in this talk. Now, the goal of this talk, and actually the goal of my research in the past few years, or part of it, has been to try to understand how do you compute algebraic invariant associated to these spaces. And this is why Fred is guilty. So he's actually, together with Alejandro, the two of them started thinking about this, and they derive a very nice stable splitting of these spaces, which allow you to try to make computations, although those explicit computations can be quite tricky in general. Now, there is a first result that one has. This is a joint work with Alexandra Peter and Juan Soto, which is how to compute the fundamental group of such spaces. And even in the case of the fundamental group, this is not so easy. But the answer that you obtain is actually quite nice. So if you have a compact Lie group, the commuting tuples you can see as a subspace of G to the n. Now, the fundamental group of G to the n is very easy to compute. Namely, the fundamental product of a product is the product of the fundamental group. So this is isomorphic to n copies of the fundamental group of G. And what we realize is that in this space, which is very singular and you can only move through the commuting n tuples, due to some dimension counting, you can realize that everything you can deform to obtain something like this. So in other words, what this is saying is that the fundamental group of the commuting n tuples is the same as the one of G to the n. So the answer here is very simple. Okay. Now, what I want to convince you of is that this is no longer true if you take higher homotopy groups. Okay, so for the second homotopy group, this is not going to work. Okay, and it is not going to work because, as is well known, the second homotopy group of any Lie group is trivial. So if this were true for the second homotopy group, that would say that the second homotopy group of the commuting tuples will be trivial, but that's not going to be the case. Okay. Now, I should remark that throughout this talk, I'm just going to take as the base point for this space and this space just the identity, comma, the identity, namely the trivial commuting n tuple. Okay. So the goal of this talk is to compute the second homotopy group of these spaces, and the goal of the last part of my talk is to try to convince you of geometric interpretations of the computations that I'm going to provide, which is actually the motivation behind this work. Okay. Now, there are a couple of simple observations that allow you to reduce this computation to the case of simply connected Lie groups. But I do want you to keep in mind something. I don't want to work with groups that are not compact, because life is very complicated there. Omar's talks show you that commutativity for non-compact groups can be tricky. Okay, so the very first observation is that whenever I have a covering space of Lie groups, then when you pass to the commuting guys, is also a covering space. But here is very important to put these connected components, otherwise this result is not true. Okay. Now, because this is a covering space, you immediately obtain the fact that these guys have the same second homotopy group. If you have a covering space, that induces isomorphism in homotopy groups starting from dimension 2. So if you take the universal cover of G, then that tells you that you can reduce to the simply connected case, but then the universal cover of a Lie group may not be compact. It is going to be compact if the group is semi-simple. So I don't want to do that. Now there is another observation which is also quite trivial, but it's going to play a role here, is that if I take commuting tuples in a product, it's the same as the product of you can't work one group at a time. Okay? Using those two propositions, you can reduce to the case of simply connected compact Lie groups because of the following fact. Now, from the classification of compact Lie groups, you know that if you have a compact Lie group, then you can take the derived group. Okay? I'm not sure what I call it there. I think I made a mistake, but it doesn't matter. So you take the derived group, and there is a number, an integer k, in such a way that there is a covering space. In fact, you can write down any compact Lie group as a central quotient of the derived group with a torus. So in fact, this tells you that this map is a covering space. Okay, so that tells you that due to the first proposition, that then you can work with the second homotopy group of the cover. Okay, but due to the second proposition, you can look at the commuting n tuples in this product and see it as a product of the ones that commute here and the ones that commute here. Okay, so there is just something very simple, but it's going to be important. Well, this space, if I put the 1 here, is going to be the commuting guys in the K torus cross the commuting guys in the derived group. But this guy is abelian, so this gives me a product of circles. And a product of circles have trivial second homotopy group. So when I look at the second homotopy group, using this trick, so the second homotopy group of the commuting guys here is isomorphic to the commuting guys here, which is isomorphic to this, but this in second homotopy group, it doesn't play a role. So you can work without loss of generality with the derived group. Now, the derived group is compact and semi-simple. It doesn't have to be simply connected, but it's semi-simple, which means that you can take the universal cover and you obtain a simply connected, compact, a semi-simple group. So you can work with that one. So I should have put a D here. So my notation is different. That's what I just realized. So if you take the universal cover of the derived group, there is a natural map from E to G, and that induces an isomorphism at the level of second homotopy group. So what that tells you is that you can work with you can work without loss of generality with compact, simply connected, and semi-simple Lie groups. But here we go again. Remember, for products you have this, and any semi-simple, simply connected compact Lie group is the product of simple guys. So you can work without generality, without loss of generality, with just simply connected, simple, with compact, connected, simply connected, and simple Lie groups, which is what I'm going to do. Namely, you reduce to work with the 4 families and the exceptional groups. Okay, good. So let's do that. So from now on, I'm just going to take G to be compact and simply connected and simple. Okay? Now, with the result that I showed you before of Alexandra Petet and Juan Soto, well, since G is simply connected, then the commuting L tuples is also going to be simply connected. So that Hurewicz theorem tells me that if I want to compute the second homotopy group, I just need to compute the second homology. And that's what we are going to do. Okay? Now, as a first step towards the solution of this problem, one has the following computation. If I look at the homology with rational coefficients, that's actually quite simple. Is a vector space of dimension n chose 2. And I like to show you where that comes from, because it shows an idea that is due to Tom Baird, which is very useful if you want to understand these guys. Now remember, if I want to concentrate on this component, those are the ones that have the property that are inside a maximal torus in G. Here's the point. Maximal tora in G, the maximal tora in G are unique up to conjugation. Okay? In other words, we can do the following. So let's fix T a maximal torus. And I'm going to denote by W the Vega group. Okay? So the conjugation map gives me a natural map to the commuting n tuples. And this is something that I already mentioned. If I have a commuting n tuple, if I conjugate it, that's also commuting. Okay? Now, a maximal torus is abelian. So you can conjugate an n tuple in the maximal torus, and that gives you a commuting n tuple, namely, so you have a continuous map this way. Due to the characterization that I gave you, this map is actually surjective, but it is very far from being injective. Now, there is a simple observation, which is the normalizer of the maximal torus acts naturally by conjugation on T to the n, but it also acts by multiplication on the right-hand side with the inverse on G. So I can see naturally this guy acting on the product. Okay? So namely, H acting on T1 Tn is simply conjugating by it, and H acting on any element of G is multiplication on the right by H inverse. And the observation is that this map factors through this action. And this is a trivial observation, because if you take this and conjugate it with this, the H cancels out. Very simple observation. So basically, the conjugation map you can see as a map that you factor through this action. So I'm going to write it like this. So since the original one was surjective, this is also surjective. But I'm going to rewrite this as G mod T cross T to the n mod up by the Vega group. And the reason that I'm doing this is that inside the normalizer is the maximal torus. But that guy is abelian. So this action is trivial. So I can do this quotient in two stages. I factor first through T. Here is abelian, so I put the action on the left-hand side, and what it remains, I mod up by W. Okay? This is actually where, if you look at the previous, the case of SO3, this space that appears here is exactly this one. Okay? Okay. Now, there is a very nice observation due to Tom Baird, and it is the fact that, well, this map is surjective, but is not injective. So that's something that you have to realize. And the fact that it's not injective is because the centralizers of elements in a Lie group, they are very different. They can be very large. So for example, if you have a central element, that already is a problem. So central elements make it that this guy is not injected, because if you conjugate by any central element, then that guy goes to 0. In any case, this map is not injective, but there is a simple observation. The fibers of that map have rationally acyclic cohomology and cohomology. So, using the Vietoris-Beagle theorem, it follows that in homology with rational coefficients, this map induces an isomorphism. So if you want to do computations with rational coefficients, you can forget about the commuting guys. So if I want to compute the second homology of this guy, we want to think about the second homology of this guy. But if we're working with rational coefficients, this quotient you can take as invariant. So that's the same as the second homology of G mod t cross t to the n with rational coefficients, and you just take the ones that are W invariant. Okay? And then, so you use Q-net theorem here, and you realize quickly that you have 3 pieces. There is a piece that is the second homology of G mod t, which is the flag manifold, and I have to take the W invariance of that. But there is a key feature of the flag manifold. If you forget about the grading, the homology and the cohomology of the flag manifold is the regular representation. If you forget the grading. And when you take in the regular representation, there is only one copy of the trivial representation, and that's concentrated on degree 0. So that tells you that the invariance of the second homology of the flag manifold is trivial, so that doesn't play a role. There is another term, which is when you take H1 here and H1 here, but the flag manifold is simply connected. In fact, you can construct a CW complex structure using even dimensional cells, namely the Schubert cells. So that shows you that this gives you just the homology of t to the n, but only take the invariance. And we can play this game again. This is, again, is a product. It's a product of n copies. And you use the Q-net theorem. Again, you have to be a little careful. So you have 3 possibilities, 2, 0, 1, 1, and 2, 0, 1, 1, and 0, 2. The 2 being the same. Now, when you take the 2 homology of t and you think about invariance, that guy is going to be trivial. The reason for that is that, again, if you think about the homology of t to the n of t, I'm just thinking about t, and you take the invariance, that's going to be the same as the homology of the quotient. And we're working in a simply connected compactly group. T mod by the action of the Weyl group is homeomorphic to the Weyl alcove, right? And that's simplex. So that's contractible. So that's trivial. So with that argument, you show that this is n just 2 copies, because I have, when I use Q-net's theorem, I have n copies and I have to pick 2 by 2. So that's where this gives you, where this n just 2 comes into play, of the first homology of t, tensor with the first homology of t, and you take the W invariant. Okay? So to finish the proof, I just have to convince you that this guy is one-dimensional. Now we're going to use a little bit of representation theory. Okay? And I'm going to change rational coefficients to complex coefficients so that the representation theory works better. Okay? Let's use that here. Now, if you use complex coefficients, there is a way to describe the first homology of the maximal torus. So if I look at the first homology of the maximal torus with complex coefficients, I can describe this using the Lie algebra. So namely, this is isomorphic to the dual of the complexified Cartan algebra. So at the end of the day, what I need to do is take two copies of the dual of the complexified Cartan algebra and take the W invariants. Okay? And here's where representation theory comes into play. If you want to look at this guy, well, that's going to be a vector space. And if I have a vector space, well, I just have to think about the dimension. The dimension of that vector space tells me the number of times that the trivial representation appears in T times T, or their dual. So this is the number of trivial summands, of trivial representations in the dual tensor itself, so two copies of it. And you can count that using representation theory, namely you can use the characters to compute that. So let me call by chi the character of the dual of the total subalgebra with complex coefficients. So what I like to do is I like to count how many times the trivial representation appears in this times itself. So I like to take the inner product of the square of the character with the representation 1. That tells me if I take the inner product of the character of any representation with 1, that tells me how many times the trivial representation appears. And there is a very simple observation. So this inner product is the average. So you have to take, in this case, 1 over the order of the Weyl group, and then you take this guy evaluated times evaluated 1, so that's that. So I have to put the square here. But this representation is real. So because it's the action of W on T, and then you complexify it. So you can rewrite this as this. But when you run it like that, you just have to make a simple observation. When the Lie group is simple, the Cartan algebra is going to be an irreducible representation over the Weyl group. So that gives me the inner product of a representation with itself, and that is equal to 1 when the representation is irreducible. So that's the proof. Because this tells me that there's only one copy of the trivial representation here, so that tells me that this guy is a vector space of dimension 1. So that tells me that this vector space is a vector space of dimension 1, so this gives me what I wanted. Okay. That took longer than expected. But so this is a very useful idea in this business. Okay, based on that, because one can prove that when G is compact, the commuting n tuples has the homotopy type of a finite CW complex, then the second homology, which is the second homotopy group in this case, is going to be, well, a finally generated abelian group. So that tells me, the previous computation tells me that I know what the free part is, and I remain to know what the torsion part is. Okay? So we're going to do that. The task is to compute this guy here in general. And we're going to use a weird idea. So you're going to work backwards from what one would usually do. So there is an observation. I had already told you that there was conjugation action without this. Now the observation is that when you conjugate in that connected component, that the connected component is preserved. So you can look at the conjugation action. And you can do the Borel construction. Yeah.
In general, it's only telling you that the difference is torsion.
Yes.
Which could be infinite.
Yes. Well, 1 second, but this is a finite CW complex. Okay? So that's why it's a finite abelian group, right? One can prove that this guy has the structure of a CW complex, but the group is compact, so this space is compact, so it's finite, so there's no problem. But you're correct. Okay, so this is why I'm saying that we're going to work backwards. I want to know the second homology of this group, and I'm going to do the Borel construction. So the Borel construction gives me always a fibration, where the base space is BG, and the fiber is this guy. Now, keep in mind, we're working with a simply connected Lie group. That implies that pi 1 and pi 2 are trivial. And that implies that BG is 3 connected. So pi 0, pi 1, and pi 2 are trivial. So when you look at the Serre spectral sequence of this fibration, in total degree 2, there is only one non-trivial degree, and you obtain trivially that the homology of the commutative n tuples is the same as the homology of the Borel construction. Normally, one will go the other way. I'm going from a compact space to an infinite dimensional space, so I'm making it more complicated. But we're going to be able to pull this off in some cases by looking at the right-hand side. Now, why on earth would you do this? And I think we all agree, this is not the first idea that you should try, nor the second. But nonetheless, when you start thinking about the idea that was used here, there is some idea about the fibers, and that more or less lets you, after many failed attempts, to say that maybe you should look at this guy. And that's basically what happened. We thought about this many ways, and okay, let's do a desperate attempt and look at this guy. Now, here comes what is useful here is that this guy is not only a CW complex, but you can see it as a GCW complex. That there are some general results that you can use to prove that. So there is a Seagal's kind of spectral sequence here, so to compute the homology of the Borel construction, namely there's a Breton homology spectral sequence that you can use. And the Breton homology spectral sequence that you have gives you a spectral sequence whose homology is the homology of the Borel construction, and the E2 term is the homology of the Breton homology of the space that we want, with coefficients in this covariant system, coefficient system, that to an orbit gives you the homology of the classified space of the corresponding isotropy subgroup. And then you say, okay, let's look at that spectral sequence. And in general, in the general case, that's going to be a nightmare. And I looked at the case of spin groups, and I know some things. So you can get some partial answers, but it's a nightmare. But there are 2 cases where you can pull this off. Namely, the cases of the unitary groups and the symplectic groups. And those 2 groups are good because when you look at the conjugation action on the commutative n tuples, that has 2 properties. The isotropy subgroups are of maximal rank, namely contain a maximal torus, but the second one that is key here are connected. So using that idea and some further work, you can show that basically in the spectral sequence, everything collapses except in degree when Q equals 0, and when Q equals 0, it gives you this. In other words, which is very, very interesting, what this is telling you is that the second homotopy group for these spaces, for these Lie groups, is the same as the second homology of the space of representations, which is the same. The space of representations is also simply connected. Put it in different ways. The quotient from commuting tuples to the space of representation induces isomorphism in the first fundamental group and also in the second homotopy group. And when we get to this point, I know what to do because I play with Fred. Fred and I play with these gadgets about 10 years ago. Now, there is a little bit of an issue. The special unitary group is trickier than the unitary group. Why? Because of the action, the way the action, when you look at the maximal torus, for the unitary group is the diagonal matrices and then the bar group rotates. So it's a permutation. For the special unitary group, you need the diagonal elements to multiply to 1. And then that makes it complicated. So first, I started the talk saying, oh, I'm going to reduce this to simply connected space. Now I'm going to go backwards. Now I'm going to go back to the case of the unitary matrices. But in this case, they are the same. So based on the previous results, what I have to do is I have to compute the second homotopy group of this quotient. And that quotient, you can rewrite as to obtain a symmetric product. And now we are in the land of the classical algebraic topology that Fred is an expert. So one can make computations. So I want to compute the second homotopy group of this guy. Now the second homotopy group of this guy it has a little complication. Now, for homology, there is a well-known homology stability for the symmetric products. For the second homotopy group, it's not that well known, and in this case, it does happen to be the case. So if you want to compute the second homotopy group, you do have stability after when you put m equals 3. But if using that stability, you can go to the infinite symmetric product, and then you can use the famous result of Dold and Thom that tells you that the second homotopy group of the infinite symmetric product is the homology of the space, which in this case is this guy. So that in this case, we can prove that for any pair, for any n greater or equal to 2, and n greater or equal than 3, the second homotopy group doesn't contain torsion. Okay. Now, there is a special case, which is the case m equals 2. But that one you can do by hand, and you obtain this result. So there is some delicate torsion in this case. Now, for the symplectic groups, and this is actually an observation due to Fred. So I actually met Fred about 10 years ago, and we were talking by email, and I told him that I was going to be visiting a friend that was going to grad school in Rochester. So he told me, "Why don't you stop by my house?" And we were talking exactly about this. I was telling Fred, "Oh, look, this is very nice. You should know about this. You are an expert in these things." And I told him, when you look at the space of representations, you get a symmetric product. And then Fred told me, "Oh, we should look at the case of the symplectic matrices." And I was like, "Okay." But we were very tired, and then Fred told me, "Come tomorrow." And then I came the day after, and he told me, "Oh, it works the same way." So for the symplectic matrices, you can take T as the diagonal matrices, but then the Weyl group acts by permutations with sign. But using the same idea, the representation space is also a symmetric product of something more complicated. Namely, you take the same n torus as before, but you need to modify an action of SEMO2, which is given by complex conjugation on each circle. Okay, so one observation is that this guy is simply connected, and we want to compute the second homotopy group. So and the second homology, which is the same. And it is well known by some results, I believe, of Steenrod, that the map in symmetric products is split injective. It's actually, he proved it at the level of chains. So that I can use the same trick as before, because this map is split injective, and I can look at what happens in the infinity case, but in the infinity case, it gives me the first thing that I started with, so there is also a stability. So using that, one concludes that the homology, the second homology of the symmetric product is this homology, and rewriting everything, one obtains the result for the symplectic groups. So which is not by coincidence the same thing that was happening for SU2, because SU2 is SP1, and we have a stability. Okay. Now, when do I have to end? When did we start? Nobody knows. I believe it was 12. Okay, well, I think it's at least 35, so let me use 5 more minutes. There are two cases, so this case and this case, but what I like to point out is that when you look at n equals 2, in both cases, something happens. For pairs. For pairs, in both cases, you only get the integers. And in both cases, there is stability from the very beginning. Okay? And SU2 is the same as SP1. So in other words, this result actually comes from this computation. Okay? And if you sit down with some patience, you can actually construct geometric generators of that guy. Okay? Now, what does that have to do with anything? So I just gave you some computations of some homotopy groups, and okay, so that's kind of nice, but why should I care about this? So the initial motivation of this work was not to compute that. So let me go back to what Omar was talking about, which is the space become G. Okay? And recall that this lives inside of BG. Now, the space BG is quite important in topology because it classifies principal G bundles. Namely, if I have a principal G bundle over X, I can think about that guy as the pullback of the universal principal G bundle. Okay, so isomorphism classes of principal G bundles over a space, of reasonable space, are in one-to-one correspondence with homotopy classes of maps from X to BG. But inside of BG, there is become G. So a natural question is, what happens when the classifying space, the classifying map of a bundle factors through become G? And then something quite nice happens, and this is something that I worked out with Alejandro, and it's the following. If you have a principal G bundle, the classifying map of that bundle factors through become G if and only if the bundle is transitionally commutative. What do I mean by that? I mean that you can find an open cover of the base space and trivializations in such a way that the transition functions that you obtain form a commutative cocycle, meaning they commute with each other whenever they are simultaneously defined. So this guy classifies principal G bundles. This guy classifies, and that's why we call it the classifying space for commutativity, classifies principal G bundles with some further structure. So those are the bundles that are appearing from commutative cocycles, although stating explicitly what the the additional structure is quite tricky, and Alejandro and I made a mistake at first with that structure. So let's just say that the additional structure can be, there is a homotopical way, which is the simple way to describe this. So the additional structure you can think of, so this is the classifying map, so think about bundles with an additional structure, which is a lifting of the classifying space, of the classifying map to become G. Okay, so we care about this guy because of this. Now, once you get into that business, what I'm about to do is more or less natural, which is, well, why don't you take G equals the unitary group? Well, in that case, principal G bundles are the same as vector bundles. So when you look at this condition, then you get vector bundles that are transitionally commutative. And then once you start thinking about vector bundles, you should think about K-theory. So you can form the space become U, which is the colimit when n goes to infinity of become UN. One of the things that we prove in our joint work with Alejandro, Ulrike Tillman, and John Lin is that this space has the structure of an infinite loop space. In other words, there is a cohomology theory behind this that we call, in this case, if I just take that would be reduced commutative K-theory. So with this guy, we get reduced commutative okay? But once you get to that, the very first thing that you should think about is some calculations, and the basic calculation is what happens with the spheres. Now, and this is a theorem by Simon Grischafer. So Simon Grischafer actually computed what this is. And the commutative K-theory, which you can think about as the n homotopy group of become U, is given by set to the K if n is 2 times K and 0 else. Okay? So this is very different from traditional K-theory where you put a K, the K is not here. So the first group where they are different, or the first sphere where they are different is the fourth sphere. Okay? And I wanted to know I wanted to construct geometric generators for that group. So the motivation behind this question is, how do you find generators for the two classes here? Okay, and you can do that using commutative cocycles. Okay, so if you don't mind, let me just use 2 more minutes. I think since the starting time is not clear, the ending time can also be unclear. So I'm just going to use a couple of minutes to finish. So there is one generator which is easy to construct, which is the following. So I need to, so here's become U inside of BU. Okay? And I want to construct the generator. So one basic idea is you choose one in such a way that you get, when you compose, you get a geometric generator of reduced K-theory. Okay? So you can construct that very easily using cocycles. How? I'm going to take a structure group equals to SU2, which as a space is the 3-sphere. And I'm going to describe a vector bundle using cocycles. And I'm going to choose a very simple open cover. You take the 3-sphere minus the north pole, the 4-sphere minus the north pole, and then the 4-sphere minus the south pole. so that the intersection is homotopy equivalent to S3. So I'm going to take a cocycle on this cover with values in SU2. So I just need to take a map of degree 1. So I'm giving you an open cover with two open sets with a cocycle. And the observation is, well, that cocycle is commutative. Why? Because there are only two open sets. So there is no commutativity going on. The same thing that Omar was talking about. So this is like the classical generator. And then there is the other one that is quite tricky. And why is it tricky? Because the other one should be coming from a map from the fourth sphere to here. But when you include this into DU, should be trivial. Should be no homotopic. Namely, you should find a principal G bundle that is trivial as a bundle, but is not trivial as a transitionally commutative bundle. So that's something that was very tricky, and I was very interested in constructing such objects. And then I found a paper by Dan Ramras and Bernardo Villarreal, which I think is great, that had an idea that you can use to construct the other generator. And the idea is very simple. I'm taking a lot longer than I'm just going to finish here. The idea is I'm going to split the sphere into three closed sets. As I'm describing it, it should be open, but you can enlarge them a little bit. But this picture is on the two sphere. Well, think about the same picture, but in the four-dimensional sphere. The triple intersection, in that case, is the second sphere. Well, to construct the geometric generator, what you should do is you should find a commutative cocycle in such a way that in the triple intersection, you get the generator that I just found. So using the idea of Bernardo Villarreal and Dan Ramras, you can obtain the other generator. And that's the main motivation for this work, and this is all I had to say. Muchas gracias. Any questions? Yeah? Noé? What about generators for KO? Oh, you caught me. I think that's a great question, and I haven't thought about that. Well, I do have a few things to say, I guess. For simply connected compact Lie groups, the first difference between these two happens in degree 4. For groups like the orthogonal groups, the first difference occurs in the second homotopy group. So I believe that Bernardo and Dan did some work in that direction, but for the case of pi 2. Now, after pi, in that case, and even in this case, after the first dimension where they differ, things get very complicated. And in fact, this is what I would like to do next in this case is, okay, so you found geometric representatives for the two classes here. Well, what about the general case? Now, for the real setting, I believe that the work of Bernardo and Dan answered the question for degree 2, but I don't know what happens in higher degrees. Obviously, I believe the real case is more complicated than the complex case. Okay. Muchas gracias.